Ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking this morning about the probability of the earliest portrait of Christ and its possible connection with the Holy Shroud. The received likeness of Christ has been a fact for 2,000 years, and the study of it has continued throughout history, independent of reference to the Shroud of Turin until comparatively recent times. The Shroud has been an object of veneration for 2,000 years, but it's only in the 20th century that it has become a matter for serious interdisciplinary study, during which connections have been made between the early Christ portraits and the familiar face of the man in the Shroud. Already today we've heard a number of experts talking about those very connections. All Shroud researchers and art historians seem to agree that there was a dramatic and significant change in the depiction of Christ, coincident with the historically documented sightings of the Holy Shroud as early as the 3rd and 4th centuries. Such portraits clearly derive from the Shroud image and have been amply demonstrated to be more than mere coincidence or imagination by the introduction and perpetuation as part of the facial features of peculiarities of the shroud cloth itself, such as crease and fold, and of that unique image, such as the forelock on the brow, the marks across the neck, the epsilon-shaped bloodstain on the forehead, and so on. Artists could hardly have continued simply to imagine such unique features of a portrait. My interest in these early portraits of Christ began with a study of the work of a little-known English artist from the mid-19th century, Thomas Heafy, about whom I wrote a book in 1986. I studied Heafy's original paintings and drawings in the British Museum, and which he'd used as the basis for his publication of them in the form of black and white etchings in the Art Journal of 1861. A later artist and writer, Wyke Bayliss, drew extensively on Heafy's work, and other authors have occasionally reproduced his drawings. It was not until I commissioned the British Museum in 1986 to produce coloured photographs of the original Heafy drawings that anyone had ever seen them in colour. Heafy had described in detail his visits to the Roman catacombs in the 1850s and later, probably in the company of the De Rossi brothers, during their excavations. He has claimed very early dates for some of the paintings he copied from the walls and ceilings of the catacombs. I published all this information, including, as footnotes, the comments by learned art scholars and shroud experts of our time, a number of whom are present today. Some of these stated that Heafy's dates could not be as early as he claimed for various reasons. It is, it seems, a current convention in scholarly circles that the earliest catacombs were about 3rd century. But why then does Fasola, as recently as in the 1974 guide, speak of 1st and 2nd century catacombs? Heafy, Bayliss and a later writer Dobson were all convinced that some of them were 1st century and that some of the portraits in those capicula were painted by persons who had either seen Christ and were painting from memory in the last part of the 1st century, or had at least had the features of the man described to them by eyewitnesses. It was the purpose of my book to put forward and emphasise this theory, hoping for scholarly comment. It was Dobson in the 1930s who presented an elaborately researched thesis concerning the activities of the apostles in Rome and their connection with those noble families beneath whose houses and under whose patronage the first Christian burial grounds were dug during the 1st century. I just have to skip a few pages which have been censored. I was certain that not all Heafy's work could be spurious, and indeed I have come upon some remarkable evidence to the contrary, which I now wish to share for the first time with members of the Shroud world. Late in 1990, I learnt through an introduction by Ian Wilson of a woman in England, Sylvia Bolonescu, author and artist, who had, quite independently of any of us in the Shroud crowd, followed a line of remarkable research into the work of Heafy and the catacombs. Convinced, as was Heafy, that the earliest paintings of Christ must surely reside in those cubicula of antiquity, and inspired by the same writers as I had been, namely Heafy, Baylis and Dobson, this indefatigable and meticulous researcher set out on a journey through the catacombs as remarkable as that described by Heafy in his 19th century articles, and then wrote a book about her experience and findings which was never published. It's a matter of historical fact that the catacombs, closed and forgotten since the earliest centuries, were then accidentally rediscovered in 1578. The stampede into them by uninitiated fortune hunters caused untold destruction of vital clues and information. The boy Sebastiano Bosio, who on 10th December 1593 recorded on a subterranean wall that he was almost lost in the catacomb of San Sebastian, was to become described as the first Columbus of the catacombs, devoting his life to their systematic excavation and recording. As Silvia Bolonescu reports to us, Bosio was unaware that the 1st century catacomb of Domitilla and the 3rd century one of Calixtus were connected. In the confusing maze between these two major cemeteries, he came across a life-size portrait of a man with wavy hair, a beard and a drape over one shoulder. He understood its importance and made a copy of the portrait by candlelight, as well as drawing a cross-section of the cubicula. He described this painting as a likeness of the Lord, but erroneously identified the catacomb as Calixtus, and therefore 3rd century, which ruled out any possibility of its having been painted by a contemporary of Christ in the 1st century. On his map, published in 1632, he described the area as the cemetery of Calixtus, called Secret. Soon afterwards, the entrance to this area was lost and not rediscovered until 1714, and was then concealed again until 1873. Aringhi translated Bosio's Roma Soterranea into Latin in 1651, thus unwittingly encouraging further vandalising expeditions into the catacombs, but in 1680 the Pope sealed them up and placed guardians upon them. In 1855, at about the time of Heafy's expeditions, the German Franz Theodor Kugler produced his handbook of Italian painting. He reproduced Bosio's portrait of Christ as it had been copied by Aringhi, but perpetuated the error of naming it Calixtus Catacomb instead of Domitilla. This is where we read the full description of the Orpheus scene from which the cubiculum has taken its name. Kugler tells us, on the ceiling, above all these historical and symbolical allusions to the Saviour, in a large medallion surrounded with a symmetrical ornament of arabesques with doves, is the portrait we have alluded to. Over the left shoulder is thrown some drapery, otherwise what is seen of the figure is unclothed. The face is oval, with a straight nose, arched eyebrows and a smooth and rather high forehead. The expression is serious and mild. The hair parted on the forehead and flowing in curls on the shoulders. The beard is not thick, but short and divided. The appearance is that of a man between 30 and 40 years of age. There is no description, it is true, nor any other sign to be found on the picture in evidence of its being the portrait of Christ. But that no other person can be intended by it appears no less from the important position it occupies and the relation in which all the other subjects in the chamber stand to it, than from the large scale on which it is executed." Unquote. In the 1850s, the Pope had authorised the two de Rossi brothers to begin excavating and recording all the catacombs. Giovanni de Rossi was determined to find the elusive entrance to Domitilla, and it seems likely that Heafy accompanied him on some of his expeditions. Heafy finally, on his own, according to his description, spent a night in what it seems was the Orpheus Cubiculum. He believed he was in the very oldest part of the catacombs, and the profile likeness he painted from the ceiling he believed to be 2nd century, according to his notes on the painting. Heafy described it as being in the catacomb of Achilles and Nereus, which eventually came to be known as Domitilla. We now know that not only did Heafy achieve what he had claimed, later to be scorned by scholars this century, but Heafy is, furthermore, the only person to have recorded it accurately. until the time of Bolonescu's 1979 photographs of it, which I shall show you in a few moments. It is very interesting and important to note that the portrait bears little resemblance to the Bosio-Aringi-Krugler representation, except for the cartouche, which definitely locates it for us. In 1865, the de Rossis finally discovered the primitive entrance to the Domitilla cemetery and estimated the date as 66 to 68 AD, bringing it right into the era of Nero and making the theory of a contemporary likeness perfectly feasible. When Silvia Bolonescu gained access to the chamber in 1979, she noted that Heafy's description, and indeed de Rossi's, of parts of the chamber's decoration being cut through was also correct, and further authentic evidence for the great antiquity of this tomb. One of the theories advanced by Bolonescu is that when Constantine sought a likeness of Christ, according to the description handed down for 300 years, it's entirely feasible that Christians who had in recent years been frequently in the catacombs copied that Orpheus Cubiculum portrait as the definitive extant example, hence the appearance of Christ as a bearded Sephardic Jew in the 4th century. Some shroud researchers would see these likenesses as copied from the shroud, and therefore evidence for its existence and observation at that time. But the idea of direct derivation from the Orpheus portrait in no way excludes the influence of the shroud. As Bolonescu also points out, it's obvious that the principal painting in an important cubiculum of the royal Flavian section of the largest and most ancient catacomb of Domitilla would have been an accurate representation of the physical appearance of Christ as his followers would have been able to remember him. Bolonescu describes that the origin of the title Orpheus comes from the main wall painting. Evidence of extreme antiquity of this cubiculum is the Phrygian cap that Orpheus is wearing and the Pompeian style of the decorations around the fresco, the small leaves and birds and the general terracotta colouring associated with the art of Pompeii, which after all died out after the eruption of Vesuvius in 79. Bolonescu accounts for the confusion of locations and dates by pointing out that there was a great area of confusion where the two catacombs met and mingled underground between the Via Appia and the Via Ardentina, aggravated by the presence of several sand quarries, and later de Rossi discovered that the passage leading from one to the other had been disguised by diggers. Whilst de Rossi understood that many of the art examples in the catacombs were 3rd century, he stated of some of those unmistakably better and older in Calixtus, quote, to rise from certain monuments of the 3rd century to equally certain monuments of the 2nd century is a great step towards arriving at the very beginning of the days of the apostles. One step more, and we shall find ourselves face to face with people who actually heard the apostles themselves, unquote. De Rossi also said that a truly ancient cubiculum had certain characteristics. Paintings in the classical style and allied to the best of the pagan art, ornamentation in fine stucco, crypts of peculiar shape, not hewn out of bare rock, but carefully built with pilasters and cornices of bricks or terracotta. No narrow galleries with shelf-like graves in the walls, but spacious ambulacra and painted walls with large recesses for sarcophagi, whole families of inscriptions with classical names, and lastly, dates of 1st or 2nd century. The Orpheus cubiculum certainly has most of these attributes. It is agreed that the deeper the passageway or the further from the entrance, the later the decorations. But the point is that Domitilla had 2 entrances made at different times and different levels. Whilst we do not know how or where Heafy got into the catacomb, we also know he could not have followed the route known today from the Basilica, which takes, as the Bolonescus attest, and as I know myself, a very long time to reach Orpheus, the ancient Flavian entrance having been again lost today, not to mention the fact that the Basilica of Achilles in Nereus was quite unknown at that time. He must therefore have entered through the original Flavian entrance, then being unearthed by de Rossi, although it was not formally declared open until 65. Bolonescu thinks from her study of the ancient maps that the primitive entrance is at the side of the Via Ardentina and at a different level from the Basilica, indeed much higher. This is corroborated by the fact that in 1979 they had to climb 2 flights of stairs from the level of the Basilica, and today the water from the gardens of Rome is dripping through the ceiling and onto those paintings, as I can attest because I was there this week. Bolonescu and her husband have studied in detail all available maps, ancient and modern, of the catacombs, and have concluded that what is described as very ancient hypogeum, unexplored, the extent and name of which cannot now be determined, merged with the 1st century catacomb of Lucena, which in turn connected with the 3rd century Calixtus. It was this area of confusion which caused the Orpheus portrait to be dismissed as old, but not old enough to qualify as a contemporary likeness. The confusion of the names and dates of these catacombs continued until de Rossi's successor, Marucci, said in his 1903 guide to the catacombs, the great cemetery of this Appian Way, that one of Domitilla or of Tor Marancia, is the biggest of all the Roman Sotteranea. Bosio knew it, but he had only seen one secret part of it. Anyhow, it's certain that Domitilla had property in this place, and although Bosio imagined this cemetery to be that of Calixtus, nobody ever doubts that it's really that which in olden times was known as the Domitilla cemetery. That the ceiling portrait in Orpheus is almost unknown is partly attributable to another extraordinary error over the centuries, only recently discovered by the Bolonescus. When they went to Domitilla in 1979, the cubiculum did not at that time appear on any modern map. The main reason for this is that all current maps are derived from de Rossi, who in turn used those of Bosio as his guide. The de Rossi map does not show the Orpheus curriculum, although it's listed in his key as number 20. The Bolonescus went back to the source and researched Bosio's original, only to find that the top part of the printed map showing the Orpheus curriculum on Bosio's map, where it's number 27, had simply been cut off by the printer of the de Rossi version because it did not conveniently fit the format of the page. Thus, the myth which suggested that Heafy's portrait did not exist was compounded on account of the misdescription of it being in Calixtus rather than Domitilla, that it had not been connected with the Orpheus chamber, and for a whole host of other reasons. When the Bolonescus sought the Orpheus curriculum in 79, they arrived at what was unmistakably that Orpheus curriculum. They noted the details of the paintings in the chamber and its architectural features, all of which matched her knowledge from long research of the subject. As she looked towards the ceiling, there was insufficient light to discern the painting with the naked eye, but she was allowed to take photographs of it with a very primitive camera that she had, and managed, without even being able to focus, to fire at the ceiling, as she says, with only the eye of faith. She was to be rewarded a few days later, as indeed are we all, when the film was developed, because she had 6 pictures in colour of the missing portrait copied by Heafy so long before. And there is no doubt about the fact that it is the one which Heafy copied. I'm going to go quickly, Madam Chairman, now towards the end of what I wanted to say. Very briefly, I asked Professor Alan Wanger, whose work is well known to Shroud circles with his overlay technique, to consider the comparison between Heafy's painting and the photographs of the original portrait. And he states that they are very highly congruent, and tabulated 65 points of congruence to show that. And he also mentions that it's remarkable that Heafy produced as good a copy as he did, working from an image over his head and by candlelight. It's interesting and important to study those conclusions because of the strong possibility that both portraits may have derived from the shroud, and that none of what I'm saying today excludes that position, although I'm concerned only with indicating that Heafy is cleared from the charges by one scholar that he was erroneous and absurd, and by another scholar as inaccurate, incredible, fraudulent and dishonest. So through this extraordinary series, just to conclude, Madam Chairman, of clues and researches that I've described, I believe the following matters have been established. 1, there are catacombs below Rome containing paintings probably dating to the 1st century. 2, the second Flavian entrance to Domitilla emphasises the great antiquity of the Orpheus curriculum and destroys the argument that Orpheus is more distant from the entrance and therefore more recent. 3, the portrait, copied inaccurately by Bosio but with great accuracy by Thomas Heafy, is extant today, has now been identified and located and photographed. 4. Thomas Heafy, if like most other copyists sometimes was inaccurate, nevertheless provided us with the only accurate copy of the Orpheus portrait of Christ, despite being executed under conditions of great difficulty. 5. This probably 1st century portrait is very likely the work of an artist who had seen Christ, or at the very least worked from a description given to him by an eyewitness. 6. This is probably then the very first portrait of Christ in existence, showing him as a Sephardic Jew rather than a stylized Greco-Roman beardless youth. 7. The features of the man in this portrait match closely with those of the man in the Shroud of Turin, suggesting either that the portrait could have been painted by someone who had seen the image on the shroud, or at the very least, it and the shroud are depictions of the same man. And 8, all of the above matters, I think, add to our already extensive evidence for the existence of the shroud in the 1st century AD, and not being some kind of invention of the Middle Ages. The near certainty that we now know the whereabouts of this portrait suggests to me that it should be widely promulgated through Bolonescu's photographs or in some other way. And I would like to invite the international experts on the early portraits and on the catacombs to tell me where Bolonescu and I may be incorrect. And Madam Chairman, may I just conclude by showing only a few slides, just to take 2 minutes. That's all. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Dr. to just have the last slide. The first slide shows you the original version of the map of 1632. And this, I'm afraid from where I'm standing now, it's not quite in focus. We have the next slide, which is an enlargement of that showing the cubiculum of Orpheus in the top part, you'll notice, of the map. Next slide. In De Rossi's book, the one that everybody's looked at, can you see that the top of the map was chopped off by the printer? And that's the map that everybody's been using, which is why nobody realised that this Orpheus portrait was in fact in that curriculum. Next slide shows you the standard photograph of the Orpheus curriculum, but it does not show the ceiling, and that's where the portrait of Christ is. And to my knowledge, no reproduction of that exists. The next one, simply showing you the entrance to the curriculum. Next. This is a close-up of the Orpheus portrait from which the curriculum takes its name, and also shows you that there were many cutouts in the curriculum which indicates its antiquity. Next. This is this is another one internal. Next. This is Bosio's reproduction, which was erroneously described as being in the Calixtus catacomb, and therefore must be 3rd century, and also the head is facing the wrong way. Next is Kugler's copy of it, which further perpetuated the mystery. Next. Here now is Silvia Bolonescu's photograph of the original portrait, which is still there today, showing a Sephardic Jew, bearded, with all the features that we've come to know, the long hair falling to the shoulders, and even there the trace of a white cloth or garment over the shoulder. Next. Here's another view of the same. Next. There's a close-up of it, showing all those features that we've talked about. Next. That is the copy done by Thomas Heafy, very obviously of that precise painting. Next. This shows now on the same scale as the Heafy portrait, the portrait on the ceiling, and the next slide shows the two overlaid. This is an overlay by Wagner of the portrait itself and Heafy's copy. And then lastly, the last slide shows the points of congruence which